Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Roll. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a student assistant for the Men and Masculinities program. With me is Matthew Pringle. Matthew, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Matthew Pringle. I use he, him, his pronouns.
And do you want to introduce our guest?
With us today is Amanda Simonich, and I'm going to let her introduce her, even though I just used her name.
All right. So as Matthew said, my name is Amanda Simonich. Pronouns she, her, hers. I'm a fourth year English major at Cal Poly, getting ready to graduate, and I'm also part of Pulse, Campus Health and Wellbeing, their real team, and I work as a peer health educator talking about topics such as mental health, mental illness, mindfulness, self-care, and just kind of everything related to general well-being.
Cool. And Matthew, do you want to introduce what our theme is for this month?
So for those who have never been to a speaker series, this is a speaker series. We are gonna be talking about, typically it's a 20-minute presentation, 20-minute presentation followed by some discussion questions. And if any of you all who are watching this have any questions you want to add, you're more than welcome to. The theme for the topic for this time is masculinity in the ag community in regards to mental health and how those are all related. And so as a part of it, we've brought in a specialist, Amanda Simonich, who will be talking about mental health in relation to the ag community. Amanda is from Tracy, California, which is an ag city.
Yeah, and we will be talking about mental health because May is Mental Health Awareness Month. But with that, we'll throw it off to you, Amanda. Hand it off to you, actually.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. As they both said, I will be talking about mental health in the ag community. And as I said, I work on campus talking about mental health and trying to educate on that topic. But before that, I came from Tracy, California, which is in the Central Valley. It's kind of an urbanized place now, but most people know it just from like driving through it to get somewhere else that's far more interesting. And there is like a really big ag community that my family is a part of. We have over 200 goats. So it's kind of intense. It takes up a lot of time. But just growing up in that community, as someone who struggled with mental illness and mental health, I just noticed right off the bat that there was never really a space to talk about it. And that's kind of what had driven me to leave it and major in English and decide to major in it my senior year of college, just because I felt like there wasn't really a space for me in that community as someone who was kind of dealing with chronic mental illness. But then as I kind of went through college, I got more perspective on that. So it's cool to talk about it here today. But yeah, that's the thing, I guess. Mental health in the ag community, it's just really not talked about at all. And with that being said, I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form, but I can just talk about my personal experience with the community.
Matthew.
All right. So I guess to start off, just to kind of put into terms what, when we talk about mental health, what we're talking about, because it can sometimes be conflated with mental illness. But mental health is just like physical health. It's something that we all have, and we're always on some kind of spectrum with it. You can have positive mental health and be living with mental illness, or you can have poor mental health at a time and not have any diagnosed mental illness. It just depends on where you're at and how well you're taking care of yourself, or just the different circumstances. But mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. And something that can have a really big effect on that is just the different like stressors that we're subjected to. And I mean, each career or occupation or lifestyle can come with its own stresses. And with the ag community, there's just a specific set, I guess, that comes with that can really affect mental health. So I guess going into those a little bit, one of the biggest ones, I guess, would be kind of economic factors, which, I mean, financial strain can be so stressful regardless of how much you value money in your life. And with ag, regardless of if you're farming or just in any kind of job really within that, it's really unreliable as a financial and economic are just, yeah, it's really unreliable in a sense that your income will change and vary kind of every single year depending on the market and industry. And especially if you're farming, just it doesn't matter if you yield the same crop every year. It depends on who's buying it and the climate and how much it rains. And that's just a really stressful situation to be in, to have that unreliable sense of income. And I think that gets really ingrained just in like the ag lifestyle, that sense of uncertainty and just having to deal with it and bear it and not really show that stress, but it's kind of always there. And then there's also that pressure, I think, of urbanization, where ag isn't really one of the most celebrated, I think, jobs and occupations and lifestyles. And there's always that pressure of like closing out ag areas and like needing more room for cities and stuff. And I think that can really add to that sense of stress. And then something really interesting just about right now, like especially looking at COVID, for example, a lot of people in the ag community haven't been as affected, just like still being able to go to work and like go and bale hay, even though their like actual jobs aren't happening. But there's still a sense of stress just with everything being different, but it's not really talked about and you're not really expected to process it, I guess. But yeah, I guess going into a little bit the role of, you know, masculinity in talking about mental health and in the ag community. Something I've noticed while in college, just coming back and forth and looking at my family specifically, is that when mental health is talked about, it's seen as a consequence of experience almost, and like of living, rather than something like something biological or something that you can just be dealing with without like an explanation. It seems like it's more acceptable to deal with it when you're older, after you've experienced all of these years of stress and strain as a farmer, but not when you're young, or not when you're just kind of born, maybe predisposed to it, or when you've had like other, you know, experiences that have made you maybe have poor mental health. So when I talk to my dad about it, it's like he knows a lot of people who may be dealing with depression, and it's acceptable just in the sense that like they've lived enough to be depressed and to like be struggling with it, but there's still this attitude that you have to just treat it yourself. You're not going to seek out any kind of treatment for it, and it's just something that you have to deal with. And when we talk about health, it's still very much always about physical struggles or physical ailments. It's never about your mental health, because that's something you just have to keep to yourself. And I know that that's not just specific to the ag community, and it's not just specific to men, but it is kind of a predominant factor there. And yeah, just masculinity specifically, I feel like, or if we can all kind of say that the ag community is very loud with the image of masculinity and the image of like being a proper ag man that it sets out. And there's a very traditional kind of nuclear structure there, where the man is like, there's a man ahead of the household father, and just this image of this tough father who, you know, doesn't open up to his wife or the women in his life. It has to be very much like silent, strong, resilient, independent. And that's interesting because that can cause a lot of mental strife, like having to keep that in, but then it's also this other reinforcing reason to not seek out help, because it will harm that masculine image that has to be set out of this tough, like, farmer in that role of responsibility. And with ag, there's also just this huge work ethic that's involved. I mean, with any kind of job, but there's kind of that dusk till dawn mentality of getting up and just working the day away. And there's not a lot of positive coping mechanisms that are put in place. It's not really like, oh, take a break and read, or, you know, do some mindfulness or breathing activities. It's like, oh, maybe sip a beer while you're working to take the edge off, which isn't as productive. There's not a whole lot of, I feel like self-kindness in that. There's just this, you know, push to just keep working and work the day away and then come home and then do it again the next day, which is something I've seen with, I mean, my dad specifically. My parents had a ranch and then lost it due to financial struggle before my brother and I were born. And my mom said the best thing for them was actually losing the ranch, because it just made my dad have to like kind of abandon that work ethic, and he was actually a lot happier. But now that we're back kind of in that ranching lifestyle, it's like he's making up for lost time and just has to be up there. If he's not there until 9 p.m. every night, because our property, it's not where our house is, then he's like not working hard enough. And it's just like fascinating to see that just kind of grinding and working down to the bone, and just how much it tires him, but it's like he just has to keep doing it. And that, of course, then affects his relationship with my mom, and just I think the relationship between a lot of ag men and women. And then my own experience growing up in it, just talking about the role of like kind of socialization and what you notice when you're growing up in the world around you. I had started struggling with mental illness in about the 3rd grade, but just from what I'd seen, even at that level with the environment around me, I was like, this is not something I can talk about. Like, this is not, I have to keep this to myself and just deal with it on my own. Because I'd heard my mom talk about like going to therapy and how my dad didn't approve of it and didn't like it and didn't like the way that it looked and didn't want anyone to know about it. And I've kind of seen it still just with like other family members or people around me in their relationships. Like, I think there's often a struggle for ag men to understand, you know, anxiety and things like this. And I've seen that in romantic relationships, especially, just kind of failures to communicate about that. And that's kind of a generalization across the board, and not everyone's like that. But it just has, like, I think a huge impact on the relationships that people have. And that's something that I've seen. But again, it was something that kind of pushed me to go into English, because I was like, this is not, you know, a space that I want to grow up in and like keep pursuing. But then as time went on, I realized that it is a little bit different, and I'd been kind of hard on it. But yeah, I guess further going into just why it's so hard for the ag community to talk about mental illness or mental health. And just in general, ag specifically is just such an isolated industry where outsiders aren't really invited in. Farmers are very private people. And on the one hand, there's a lack of resources and kind of money and funds allocated to mental health specifically, or education specifically targeted at rural areas and farmers and people in the ag industry. But then at the same time, there's just this level of like stigma and silence related to it. So you either just won't hear about it, or when you do, it's just, you know, all of these buzzwords that are really stigmatizing that you're not supposed to use anymore, or that you never should have. And there's just, at the base of it, when it's talked about, it seems like there might be more, it's interesting, depression might be more accepted versus something like anxiety or bipolar disorder. Those are the things that, I mean, aren't talked about at all. So even when mental health starts getting talked about, or mental illness, it's just in terms of being down or dealing with depression, but there's still a hierarchy in what is okay to be dealing with and what is not okay at all. And there's just a lot of, I think, I know a lot of people here who are very stubborn, and there's like a fear of diagnosis and just dealing with it on your own and being independent and not wanting help even when you need it. And one thing we talk about in Pulse is how you can't force anyone to get help. And that's why it can be just kind of a rough situation all around. So then talking, just to kind of maybe bring it into masculinities a little bit more, talking about like the mental health in the ag community, socioeconomic status is kind of always involved, because one of the main stressors is financial instability, and there's a lot of just, it's a very expensive industry to be involved in, even if you're just living in it or if you're working in it. And there's a lot of cases, for example, of farmers who grow food but then can't really afford to buy it just because where the economy is at. But then furthermore, when mental health is talked about, a big problem, just from what I've seen in the journalism about it and videos, is that even when depression or like the alarming suicide rate in farmers or the ag community is talked about, it's still very limited. It's typically white, middle-aged, rural farmers from the Midwest who are talked about and who are cited. And that's really problematic too, because that doesn't represent everyone who's dealing with this. And farming itself is just a very, isolated, or very independent and like, sorry, I'm blanking on words, but there's a lot of people who have been barred from the agriculture industry. And even in talking about mental health, you see that. So when it is talked about, it's just kind of one image, and it's still only okay for like certain people to talk about it. So yeah, there's I guess just talking about the toll of this, it's just there's like a perpetuating cycle that just keeps going on where like you grow up looking at the people of your family, because the family structure is so important in ag, and like what is okay to talk about with mental health, and it's so hard to not internalize that and just kind of teach it as well. And that's something that I struggled with, where I realized even being in that space that I couldn't talk about my mental health, or I thought that I couldn't, so I didn't. And then I realized that in doing that, I wasn't creating a space for other people to talk about their mental health either, because I was just being quiet about it. And that's something that you see a lot. There's just this cycle of silence about it. And if you're not creating those spaces for yourself, then you're not creating them for others either. And there's also something you don't really hear about, a rather alarmingly high suicide rate for farmers too, or people in the ag community, just because those resources aren't there. And because there's that suffer in silence, there's a higher rate of stress-related deaths and also of substance abuse, which is something I've seen. Just alcohol is a very substantial part of the ag community, and it can be, I mean, there's reasons for that. There's a lot of celebration, I guess, in ag, but I've grown up seeing a lot of people abuse it, and that's also just kind of accepted, and like another way of life, just the way that kind of getting depressed is accepted when you're 60 and have been farming your whole life. But one thing that I have noticed is that there's a lot of optimism in it. It like seems like a lot of people in the ag community are being more open to talking about mental health and just don't know how to do it because it just seems so unnatural to them. And yeah, there's still a lot of stuff that's taboo. Therapy is not something that's really welcomed. I mean, being at Cal Poly and working in an educator role has been so interesting, because there I'm very open about my mental health. But then I come home and I don't talk about it at all. And I struggle to talk to my dad or my brother about it because even though I know they need to talk about it, they just don't want to. Even talking about this yesterday, I tried to ask my brother, I was like, can I ask you a question about mental health? And he was just kind of like, what do you like? Yeah, he was just like, huh? And I was like, this isn't going to go so well. So that's something I've been trying to practice, just actually using that education from Cal Poly and actually putting it into effect here. And it's really hard, but I think I was for the longest time afraid of starting those conversations because I just assumed that they couldn't happen and that family wouldn't be open to them. But the more that I try to have them, at least the men in my family are a lot more receptive to them than I thought, as long as I kind of approach them the right way. And I think it's hard too, because when we teach mental health management, a lot of it, it's hard to not gender it, because I think, especially here, the things that in Pulse, for example, that we'll teach about self-care and mindfulness, or even meditation, it's something that a lot of ag men will not consider because they don't think that it's masculine enough. But it's really hard. You can't really put self-care into those terms. But I can't, tell my brother to stop and take a breath and to do this breathing exercise with me, because he just won't have it. But even though those things are so useful, and yeah, there's just a lot of, I think, misconceptions about ag in general, but at the same time, it's just weird to be in that liminal space, I guess, of kind of, I have one foot in it and one foot out, and mental health is one of those topics that's it doesn't have a big space in it. It's starting to have a bigger space, but it'll be really nice to see when it has an even larger one, because it really is needed in that industry. Yeah. I really don't know how long I've been speaking.
No, that was perfect. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'll start, Matthew.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned the idea of how depression is seen as being acceptable because this idea of living long enough to have dealt with enough things that would cause it. And then you'd also mention this hierarchy of what is and what isn't acceptable. So with that, would you say that a young man within the ag community, if he was dealing with or struggling with bipolar disorder, or like if he had depression, would the older ag community who like either has depression or doesn't have depression, would they see them as being like, well, you haven't lived long enough to like experience this, so like obviously like it's invalid? Like, are they more likely to invalidate that kind of like of depression, even though it's just as valid in reality?
I think a good way to look at it is with that kind of traditional message of, toughen up, like just take it in stride, rub some dirt on it. I think that happens a lot with mental health too, where it's just, I struggle with this too, just as when I come back into this space, I feel like there has to be a validation for everything. There has to be like this concrete external cause for whatever I'm dealing with internally. And I think that is something I've seen just in the dynamics of my family too, where my dad, he's at an age where a lot of people that he grew up with are passing away, or where he's just had a lot of years of strain. Where with my brother, who's farming right now, he's out somewhere, he's been working since 6 a.m. If he came home and talked about, just being tired from doing that every single day and just working equipment every single day, I think the reception would be, well, why are you tired? Like, you're young, this shouldn't be taking any toll on you. This shouldn't be draining. So I do think there can be that invalidation from above. And that's why there's a lot of just internalizing things and kind of pushing them down and not talking about them, because they're not really positively received by the older people in the community who, younger folks might look up to.
Yeah, and I know during your presentation you talked a lot about how a lot of things are fueled by perceptions of what it may look like to other people. So how big of a role do you think looking the part plays in the ag community as it relates to expressions of masculinity?
I'd say it plays a huge part. Even just looking at the Cal Poly campus.
Belt buckles, boots.
Yeah, you gotta have the boots, the buckle, the truck, the hat. There's just a very specific image that has to be portrayed. And I think that's where you also see a lot of barriers to ag, where there's very much this mentality of, I think you can say there's a mentality of like, we take care of our own, but anyone else, like, we don't need you, because it is very kind of siloed. And that's where ag gets really closed off for a lot of people, because the image of that farmer is typically a white one too, or that ag person. And that's where ag has been really barred, I think, to a lot of people. Growing up just I was a 4-H and FFA kid, and growing up in that, it was just, unfortunately, like, students of color who were involved in that just stood out because it's such a white
dominated space.
And that's so sad to see. And just that even factors into, I think you can talk about mental health there, just who feels safe in those spaces, even if they're interested in ag topics and farming. But I'd say the image definitely plays a huge role. And even just as like a woman identifying individual in that space, I always was worried, because I'm kind of, half in it, half out. I was like, felt weird not wearing boots, but then half the time I didn't really want to dress and look that part. But it can definitely play a part. And there's even just factors of, if you grow up on a ranch, you might be more, you might look the part more than someone who grows up in the city and doesn't have a wealthy farming family who has all this equipment. There's just so much that goes into that image and looking the part. And even just the amount of money that my brothers put into his like pickup to look the part, it's phenomenal.
And for those who don't know, FFA is Future Farmers of America, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just making sure so the viewers know.
Yeah.
And also, for those who don't know, 4-H is also a young farming.
Yes. What do the 4-H's stand for, Matthew?
Honor, honesty, heroes, and
you got it.
hanging.
What do they stand for, Amanda?
I actually did have to look it up. I knew most of them. I think it's head, heart, hands, and health. Very wholesome. But yeah.
Round of applause.
There's a hole. You got it.
It was a valiant effort, Matthew. And then I have one more question. Do you think visibility is one of the primary reasons there's more of a focus on physical health than mental health? Since physical health tends to be more external, you can actually see it from the outside, than mental health, which manifests itself internally a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think that is very fair to say. It's like, yeah, if you can't see it here a lot of the times, then people just won't assume, or will assume that it's not there. And I think even just talking about the existence of mental health struggles, I know I kind of got into the mindset that I wasn't seeing anyone struggling with them, so I just figured no one else was struggling around me. And then as I grew up, I was like, well, no, even though I'm not seeing it, there are a lot of people with the same experiences, and just we don't connect about it because no one starts talking about it and says, like, I see you, I'm like dealing with the same thing, we can talk about it. And I think just not being able to see it is a huge factor. Even my mom, who deals with her own mental illness, just if I'm having a down day, she's very much like, well, what's the cause of it? Like, are you physically feeling okay? And there always has to be like this reason. And I think that's one thing where I'm like, there doesn't have to be a reason. Like, there can just be an off day. And one thing too, just, I mean, looking at those physical aspects, one thing I've seen a lot is because there's such that image of what you're supposed to look like if you're in ag, and you kind of have to meet that to not be teased and made fun of, or, you know, just not welcomed in general, is that it makes a lot of people leave ag. I can think of my extended family, and there's kind of this network of us younger cousins who didn't really fit that ag image and just kind of always stood out. And I've kind of come into the, like, I guess, ag community more as I've grown up, but some of my younger cousins haven't and are just trying to get out of it. And it's like there's this network of younger cousins who just kind of, now that we're old enough to be aware, we kind of cling to each other because we, you know, there's people who are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, or trans, or just very different, who have to occupy this space of an extended, really large ag family that all looks one way. And I think you can see the struggles and like mental health experiences with us younger cousins more because we show it a little bit more, but family just kind of marks it off as like, oh, well, you're dealing with that because you're not meeting this ag image and because you're different. And there's a lot of miscommunication there that can be hard. It can be sad to see.
And I think that's why it's so important for they need to have spaces like those where people can truly express themselves and build that sort of community with one another.
Yeah. It was really relieving. I was at a wedding just last year, and I finally I like looked at one of my cousins, and we like just started talking, and it was just one of the like best conversations we ever had. I was like, what are your, like, just, I wasn't sure if it was okay to ask while we were in like that family space, but I was just like, what are your pronouns? And just hearing that like family's been getting them wrong for years, and just actually like getting to basically meet this cousin for the first time. And that, I think that's one thing that I really like, even though there's so much, it's hard to navigate that space, you know, being
so much maneuvering that must be done.
There's so much maneuvering, but like little moments like that are so worthwhile, where it's just like seeing how, as I guess the generations of my family and maybe like, you know, ag families in general go through, that there's people who kind of change their mindsets and I guess find ways to occupy that space and just be able to come into themselves more within it. I guess that's what I'm trying to do right now, because I'm like, I'm in this space and I'm going to be in it for a while, and I'm trying to actually like create that space for myself and like talk about these things rather than just kind of hide it like I did in high school.
Yeah. And then just even starting those conversations, like you asking what their pronouns are, like I'm sure that meant more to them than it even did to you, even though it did have a large effect on you. And just being able to start those conversations makes other people feel comfortable, and they're like, okay, we can actually talk about this.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to add, Matthew?
I guess because I do know that everything does take time in how you approach things. I guess a question, it's kind of just an open-ended question, but Do you think that like Cal Poly or any college campus for that matter that is ag, has a large ag population, if a mental health like dialogue group specifically, centered around the ag community, do you think like what steps do you think could be taken to like actually increase population, like rather than like, because I know in the past, like with men masculinities, like men's group, for example, it's always been like a challenge to get like
People
men
in the
to
room.
talk about things. So do you think that there's a way to like organize it in such that like you'd actually garner a lot of response to it, or would you say that that's a process that just needs to be taken step by step?
I think, unfortunately, it has to be kind of step by step. Just looking at it, I think family is so important in the ag community. And it's one of those things that, the most effective way it could get across is having like families just somehow getting, more mental health education into that structure and getting, parents and role models who actually want to talk about it more. But obviously that's not ideal, and that would take a really long time to happen. And one thing with Pulse that we've talked about is just, it's so hard you can't force people to like get mental health education, and things need to be voluntary for them to really be effective. And that's like that struggle of getting people into the room. But one thing I was thinking about with Pulse is just, we talk a lot about College of Engineering, for example, and how mental health really needs to be talked about there. And it's not. One place that we don't really talk about at all, though, is like we don't talk about ag and like College of Food or Agriculture and like Food and Environmental Sciences. And in my time there, we never did any presentations for them because there's no direct pathway into those classrooms. And I think starting with that and just making it more commonplace to talk about it and see those resources and seek them out, that's a really good first step. Because there's a lot of social pressure in that, and just like if your friends aren't talking about it, then you're not going to. And I think, it just needs to be more normalized, and just even start at that level of conversation. That's the biggest thing, just making it like normal to talk about it, and then seek resources.
Yeah. And conversations like this are where it starts.
Yeah.
So thank you for your presentation, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you. I learned a lot more about the ag community than I knew before. So
Yeah, thank you for having me. I definitely forgot to say some things, but hopefully it was substantial enough.